Hello, everybody.
Hey.
So, we did not do much advance notice, and we apologize for that.
That's
but
true.
but I did post about it in February, I think, maybe. So we're going to be talking about boundaries versus agreements versus rules today.
Yeah.
But before we talk about those, we want to start with the discussion of consent, because consent plays into this a great deal. So when we talk about consent, we're talking about an uncoerced, continual yes from a person in their right mind. So when you think about this, it doesn't just apply to sexual situations. And let's break it down. So uncoerced, like you can't, if someone has to be pressured into a yes, it's not a yes.
Yeah.
If they have to, a yes that requires verbal force is not a yes. If it's not a continual yes, if they change their mind, it is no longer a yes.
Yeah.
And if the person is in a state where they cannot make reasonable decisions, like they're drunk, they're high, they're asleep, or they're like so tired that they're loopy, they cannot consent. And in those situations, you are violating consent if you do things with them. But when that, and how that applies to greater things are like, hugs asked before giving them. And consent once does not mean consent forever. And your yes will mean more when you only use it in times it's genuine. So if you are inclined to say yes to everything, even if you don't feel it, it's not going to have as much meaning because it won't be true and it'll be something you resent. The more that you can say yes and actually mean it, the more it means. The more that you say no when you don't mean it, the more your yeses mean. So that's a little bit on consent. But so let's get down to the major topics.
Yeah.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is boundaries.
Yeah, I did a little definition of personal boundaries. Personal boundaries are guidelines, rules, or limits that a person creates to identify reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for other people to behave toward them, and how they will respond when someone I'm sorry. I don't have my glasses on. Passes those limits. They are built out of a mix of conclusions, beliefs, opinions, attitudes, past experiences, and social learning. So when you make a boundary, it's usually based on things that have happened to you in your past, and things like your moral values, things that make you feel comfortable and safe. Generally speaking, like, boundaries are to keep you feeling comfortable and safe. This is a thing that's been pretty difficult for me, actually, and it's only recently that I really understood boundaries for myself, because I've always been really bad at setting them up and then enforcing them. So
like, areas you might want to make boundaries around. So are there like certain topics you don't feel comfortable discussing? Or do certain words when used make you feel unsafe, unwanted, or uncomfortable? Are there things regularly scheduled into your calendar you both don't enjoy and truly don't need to do? Do you spend your energy on tasks that you don't value and are not necessities? Do you always say yes to helping certain people even when you begrudge them the help? If any of these are things that you tend to do, they might be areas where you might want to try setting up boundaries. And, they are hard, and they are hard to keep, and they are hard to have, but they do improve your life.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how we communicate boundaries.
Sure. So actually recently, I wrote up a Google Doc with it was also related to kink, so it had limits in it as well, but it also has a list of my boundaries, and I send that to people that I'm um going into a new dynamic with usually. These are things that people I've been in a dynamic for a longer period of time already know, but it's something that I like people who I'm getting newly involved with to understand. Um, and like everybody's boundaries are different. A lot of mine are based on triggers from past trauma. Like I can't really deal a lot with being yelled at or being like, especially like in an enclosed space, like a car. So that's a boundary. And that's just an example. And it's like keeping yourself feeling safe and comfortable is usually um, where you start with that. But you can also just verbally communicate your boundaries to people that you get involved with, or write them down and give them to people.
And I feel like the thing with boundaries is you have to be blunt. You can be tactful with your bluntness, but to set boundaries, a person has to know that it's a boundary, and so if you don't say it bluntly, and admittedly it has to be safe to say it bluntly, but if it's not safe to say it bluntly, it may not be safe to have that person in your life. So
Yeah.
But with boundaries, you have to communicate them very bluntly, because sometimes people will hear them and not understand what you mean unless you talk about them very clearly. And then they end up violating your boundaries, and it causes a lot of problems because you feel like your boundaries were violated, which they were, but the other person didn't realize there were boundaries because you didn't communicate them.
Mm-hmm.
So they had no way to know that. So honestly, the main thing is just learning how to say what you want and understanding that generally people you want in your life will want to know these things so that they don't accidentally upset you, so that they can be there for you. Because if a person doesn't know how to keep from upsetting you, if they don't know what they can do to make your life better, it's hard to connect to. And if you care about someone, you want to make them feel safe and comfortable and wanted. And so really communicating your boundaries is good for you and good for the other person. And they also, if you do that, they know that you want things when you're willing to do them. You want to do them. Like they don't have as much worries about, do you actually want to be around me or are you just feeling obligated, when they know that you'll say no if you don't want to do a thing.
Yeah.
But sometimes you've communicated them and a person just won't listen. Like with a lot of my family, I've had this problem. We don't always get along, and when I set boundaries with them, they do not take it well. So I often have to go through reinforcing the boundaries. First off, like, let the other person know that what they did was a problem and why. And this is, again, assuming safety. And you can take time if you need to, but let the person know what they did was a problem and why. Use I statements, so explain how it made you feel, so they understand, how it affects you and why it's such a big deal to you. And provide a solution for how they can fix the situation, and let them know what will happen if the solution is not met. And be willing to do the thing, provide those consequences if they need to be provided, because you can't really hold a boundary very well if you're not willing to do the hard things that may be required if someone doesn't follow it. Like I've had to, again with my parents, there have been times where I've had to take breaks from associating with them because their behavior patterns were too unhealthy and corrosive. And so I had to be willing to step away and take and deal with the consequences of that to be able to hold that boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily always fun, but if the person, a lot of times it causes the other person to learn to respect your boundaries, and then you can have a healthier relationship.
Yeah. And I think for me, at least, especially in the last year, learning to say no tied into that a lot. Just like knowing I can't do this thing. This is absolutely making me terribly uncomfortable. I need to be able to tell this person no. And just like, if you feel in your soul, that's how it sort of goes for me. Like, I really know that this is a thing I cannot say yes to, then that is definitely your brain telling you that it is time to put up a boundary and tell the person no. Like, listen to that. It's definitely become an important thing for me.
And there's also one of the harder boundaries that I'm learning to set a little bit more is with helping people, because at a certain point when I reach out to help everybody, I can drain myself, and I can't help anyone if I'm burned out or bitter. I can't save anyone, and all I can do is be there when I am capable of being there, and I'm doing no good to anyone if I push myself past my limits and then collapse. It's so, like, even boundaries around when you can be there for someone, those are, for me, the hardest ones.
Yeah.
But also some of the most important ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that I'm still struggling with that one. So we're not perfect.
No,
we're really not perfect.
I understand. That's the one that's hardest for me too, especially because, like, growing up, and I'm realizing this more now, especially while my pap is struggling so much because he's so sick. He always role modeled to me about how important it is to be compassionate with people, and he's having a really hard time with not being able to do that now, and like then also like accepting help from other people. And because he's always been like that and had a really hard time putting himself first, I sort of like inherited that from him. And so it's been really hard for me for a long time to understand, oh, I really need to say no and like take some time for myself. But yeah, it's pretty important, and it is a serious struggle when you're a person who wants to help other people.
Yeah. And there's also one other thing I want to say about boundaries before we move on to agreements and rules, would be a way that they differ from agreements and rules is that boundaries can be different with different people.
Yeah.
In the sense that, like, agreements and rules tend to be one relationship dictating a bigger group of things.
Yes.
Whereas you can have a boundary with one person, like in you can have polyamory, you can have a boundary with, one partner that says, hey, I'm not comfortable with, well, for instance, for some switch folks, they're more comfortable with dominance with some partners, submission with other partners, or there are situations, where there are certain words that make them uncomfortable with certain people, or certain types of behaviors, or that they're okay with some people and not with others, and that's okay, and that's a thing that you're allowed to have boundaries that differ.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that you value any other people any less. It just means that the way that you relate is unique and valuable in its own way.
Mm-hmm.
And but so do you have anything else you want to add about boundaries?
Not really. I mean, I've definitely also learned, like, from what you just said, of course, each partner's boundaries are different, and it can be hard to remember sometimes, like, from person to person. Like, it gets easier over time as I get to know people because I understand the differences in their personality. But I think that's why it's helpful for me to write it down and give it to
Yeah.
people who I'm getting into new dynamics with, because then they have a reference.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I would also say creating a safe environment for people to create boundaries is also something that can be really helpful to do. Like, if you are willing to, if you look for people to say no and encourage them to say no when they don't want to do something, it can make them feel a lot safer saying no, so that when they do say yes, they really mean it. Whereas, like, if someone's, if there's a big blow up if you don't want to do something, or or something like that, it can make it very difficult to feel safe to say no.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on the top, does anybody have any questions about boundaries that they want us to answer?
Or about setting boundaries or talking about them or any of that.
Or enforcing them, or... I will take that as a no, since I see no pop-ups here. More examples. Okay. Do you have some? I'm trying to brain.
Examples of boundaries?
Yeah.
Okay. So I also I'm trying to think of all of mine, but I don't okay, so I don't want to this is something like you were talking a little bit about, like different boundaries with different people, and also like it's kind of nuanced. So I can deal with and actually find sarcasm and snark amusing, generally speaking. But if I'm in a fight with you or an argument or whatever, and you get like sarcastic with me and like that kind of, like condescending way, that is an absolute boundary violation. I hate that. And it really makes me feel condescended to and like just uncomfortable. So that's another one of my boundaries. And that's the thing, is like I have to specify to people, oh yeah, you can be like sarcastic and snarky otherwise. I enjoy that, just not in that time.
Yeah.
Like
another boundary for me is like, with nearly every person, I have a lot of trouble with cohabitation. I think that the only partner I've wanted to consider that with is my partner Nikki, and any other partner, I can't do it. It overwhelms me, it gives me panic attacks, and it freaks me out. I can't handle the idea of sharing space that integrated of a way. Because my autonomy is like, I feel like my autonomy is being abridged, and it terrifies me and makes me feel unsafe.
Yeah.
So like things like that, where or just not being able to have space and time that is my own.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't have time to myself, whether it's, just sitting in the shower with the steam, or taking a little time to read or listen to music, it can make it really difficult to cope with life. Yeah. And it's something that really helps me process and keep okay. And so that is another boundary I have with people. They have to be, willing to respect the fact that I do need some space of my own.
Yeah. And another one of mine is, I think this is one that's a lot of people's, but like if I'm in the middle of an argument and I just like need a break to cool off, it's important to have that, like just to take a moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also have one that you mentioned earlier, which is yelling freaks me out. Expressions of anger that are aggressive or in any way terrify me. And I kind of cower, and it's not good. So, like, when I have conflict, I will take however long it takes me or the other person to be at a state where we can talk in a way that is not outwardly aggressive,
Yeah.
that's calm even while addressing issues. And it's easier to deal with when I know that the anger is not about me and that they
Yeah.
recognize that and it's about another situation.
Hmm.
But at the same time, it's still a little bit scary.
Yeah. And that's another reason that I like to step away from arguments is I have a lot of problems with being overwhelmed by anger when it happens. And I don't like yelling at people and being generally like mean. So I will say, I need a minute to go and calm down. And then I can come back and talk to you rationally.
Yeah.
So it's important, not just for me, but also for the other person. So yeah.
Yeah. Um, and then let's see. So, any other questions about boundaries? Okay, so I think we're going to move on to agreements. So, what are agreements? This is a definition we kind of came up with together.
Yeah.
Specific, clear, concise, and comprehensive arrangements that two people in a dynamic agree upon that are up for redefining when necessary or desired.
Yes.
So these are things that are agreed upon at the time, but the relationship won't be affected very much if they're changed.
Yeah.
Like,
they're definitely negotiable.
they're negotiable. Yeah, because with rules, you've got the idea of it can change. It can affect relationships as when they are changed. They can cause a whole redefining of relationships.
Yeah.
And that can but agreements do affect other people a lot of the time. So like if you agree that you'll only have a certain type of dynamic with one person,
Yeah.
it precludes you from creating that connection with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does affect people outside of you, and in that sense it can be somewhat coercive, but the fact that it is also open for renegotiation at any point does help mitigate some of that. But it is something that, like, I guess it's, if you make a relationship agreement, recognize that it's something that can change and make sure to remember that if it does.
And I usually make, personally, relationship agreements around my boundaries. Usually I use, that's like basically why I wanted to do this entire conversation together about boundaries versus agreements versus rules, is because a lot of my agreements in different relationships are set up around my boundaries. And just as a for instance, like I know this is obviously one for like most people who I know who are in polydynamics, but safe sex is really important. And if a partner were to have sex with somebody new, not use protection, and not tell me, that's a serious boundary violation. So
it's also safety.
So the idea is, of course, that we talk about it, and if the one of my partners does take that risk, that they explain to me, hey, I had unprotected sex, and then I can make the decision to not have sex with them until they're tested, or to use protection with that partner if I usually don't until they're tested. It's just an example.
So Ray said, I would say it could still be an agreement, even if the relationship would be strongly affected if it changed, as long as both people try and make it a clear option for things to change. And I think that's true.
Yeah.
I would also say that with things like safe sex, a lot of the part that comes up for negotiation also is, what does that mean to each partner? Because that's the thing that needs to be talked about. Like, is oral without protection a thing that's considered safe for you? In what settings? Or or are there certain partners that you're fluid bonded with? How do you mitigate the risk for your other partners if you're not with them? And it's definitely something that always involves a lot of discussion.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about agreements, is they do involve discussion, and they involve the option for change.
Yeah.
And so they're not so rigid that a person can't have choice.
Yeah.
And agency.
And my fluid bonding with different partners has changed based on risk at that current point in time too. So yeah, it's definitely a flexible thing.
So other things people might have agreements around, I think we mentioned, like, certain terms used for certain things. Like is X kink term something that you can use for something else? Or how do you go about discussing new partners? Do you want to have detailed discussions of what you do with each other? Does it turn you on? Does it, what are you okay with sharing? What are you not okay with sharing? Just basically open conversation.
Yeah.
And decisions that are open to reinterpretation over time.
And of course, you can make an agreement, like, for instance, for an example, that, like, okay, so your partner is Susie, and you and Susie have date nights on Saturdays at 8 p.m. And so you have an agreement with each other that Saturdays at 8, that's your time. Say a different partner has a very special thing coming up on a Saturday and you really want to go to that, but that's your time. And you would talk to your partner who you have that agreement with. And, like,
can you move it around?
Yeah,
is there a different date that, yeah. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't, though. Like, if it's something small that the other one, or a repeated change to that, maybe it's something you need to renegotiate.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any other questions about rules? Or, about agreements right now? Or any examples of some of their own agreements, or things that they want to share or want us to talk about more with agreements? So Sarah said communication is key, clear understandings. And yes, communication is definitely key. That is the most important thing in my mind, in relationships especially, like, just talking to each other.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna move on to rules unless you have something else.
No. And I can do the little definition that I wrote down. So rules, as we generally know them, are a set of explicit or understood regulations or principles governing conduct with a particular activity or sphere, in this case, in a relationship. So generally speaking, I think that it's this is definitely a blanket statement, but it's generally a good idea to avoid rules in polyamory because they're seen as mostly unchangeable, not flexible in the same way agreements are. The only time I'm really myself personally comfortable with rules is in kink dynamics, and only if I know they're allowed to be changed the minute I become uncomfortable, especially consistently uncomfortable with a rule.
Yeah. And that is a setting where rules have a slightly different meaning as well.
Yes, definitely.
So, yes, that is one thing we're going to talk about. Nate said rules get broken.
Yeah.
So that, and they can also be coercive. Because if you agree to a rule, you oftentimes feel like you can't change it.
Mm-hmm.
And, if it no longer works for you, if it's something that makes you uncomfortable now, if it's something that makes you feel unsafe, just because you agreed with the rule, you feel like a lot of times, I feel like, oh crap, I can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Because I made this agreement, I made this promise, and now I'm stuck, even though I don't want to be stuck anymore. And that violates boundaries, that violates consent.
Consent, yeah.
And it's something to communicate about, but it needs to be flexible.
Which of course is why I usually am more comfortable with it in kink dynamics, because there's a negotiated consent there, and there's the option to change it or walk away. And the minute that you're in a relationship and you have rules that are making you uncomfortable and you feel like you can't change them and you can't walk away, that's no longer a power dynamic that is equal. That is abuse.
That's abuse, and it's coercive.
Yeah.
And another thing about rules is they affect others outside of themselves. So if you have a rule with one person that cannot be changed, that affects other relationships, it puts it like what I mentioned before, only a certain type of dynamic with one person, or only certain terms that can be used with one person. It's not up for negotiation, or, I had a thought and it went away. But like different situations like that, where you have something that is either specifically allowed in one dynamic and not in others, or not allowed in that dynamic and allowed in others, etc. Like when you're well, it's more when it's allowed in one dynamic and not in others without the choice of all parties.
Mm-hmm.
Because it puts other partners in a position of disadvantage.
Yeah. And
Corey mentioned one penis policy.
Oh yeah, that's a terrible one. And I was just thinking, like, just as an example from agreements, the minute that's date night with Susie on Saturdays becomes a non-negotiable thing, and you have another partner who has a thing and you want to go and you can't because you can't negotiate that with Susie, then that becomes a rule and clearly might become a problem.
Yeah. And should we talk about the one penis policy?
We should.
Yes. So, for one, it is, there are so many problems with it. Where do I start?
Well, it's generally very misogynistic. That's like usually the first thing I think of, because the idea, oh God. Yeah. I mean, it's misogynistic. It's
transphobic.
It is transphobic. It's not what I would call homophobic, but it is valuing relationships, romantic relationships with women between other women, as less important.
Yeah.
So that's gross.
It minimizes, so the one penis policy is when there's a couple, right? And only one penis is allowed in any relationship that any other members of the couple have. So like the original couple that's starting to branch out, let's say, usually it's used for a heterosexual relationship with
a bisexual woman.
With a bisexual woman, yes.
Yeah.
So when the woman wants to seek another partner, they're not allowed to have a partner who has a penis.
Yeah.
So this is, one, it devalues any relationship with other women because you're just assuming, oh, it's not as serious because,
And
yeah.
yeah. And just to be clear, even if you take out the exact like actual penis thing out of it, like I've actually heard of other people, you know, taking the transphobic part out of it and saying, you know, well, like if they identify as a woman, that's still devaluing relationships with other women.
Yeah.
It's still not cool.
and you know, it's also transphobic in the sense that, not just in the sense that some women do have penises, but also in the sense that you're saying it to exclude men, which means that you're also trying to exclude trans men.
That's true.
And you're assuming, and you're either equating trans men with women, or you're not including trans men in your definition of man in some way.
Yeah.
And so, like, you're fucking over trans men, you're fucking over trans women, and you're fucking over women in general. So
yeah, it's just a really gross thing.
Yeah.
That I've always really just ew. Just really hate it.
Yeah. So that is an example of a rule that can be really damaging, and damaging not just to the person, not just to one person, but to everyone they're involved with.
And I've heard a lot of people who are new to polyamory who start out trying to make a list of rules for each other and quickly realizing that that does not work.
Yeah. I was lucky enough to not start that path, but that was mostly because I just didn't start in poly until I recognized that if I had jealousy issues with major jealousy issues and stuff like that, I needed to fucking deal with that shit before I started dating other people and dragging them into it. Which, you know, is honestly something that was not easy to deal with, and not everyone makes that decision. And it's okay to have a learning curve. Just try not to do more damage than you have to along the way.
Yeah.
But also, the other thing about rules is that they're generally not flexible and therefore can be ineffective. This is something that Nate brought up, that if they're not flexible, they may not be followed. They can't always be followed in a reasonable situation, and that when they get broken, what do? Does it cause your relationship to fall apart?
Yeah.
If you can't renegotiate, and if a person is going to break something like that, it means that they're not okay with it.
Yeah.
And therefore it goes back to the coercion. You know, even if they originally say they're okay with it, like consent, you have to continually yes.
Yeah.
So it's really important to think before putting rules in place about whether you really want to do that, and whether things are out for negotiation, and what it means if someone breaks them, even if you never think they will.
Yeah.
Especially because they're often around boundaries as well, and you know to uphold those, you have to be willing to uphold your consequences, or else they're just kind of pointless and just petty. And not just, well, okay, petty is the wrong word, I think. They're kind of pointless, and they're unable to, you know, go anywhere. If you let someone violate your boundaries in situations where you don't feel unsafe, but you just don't want to stand up for yourself, it can make it really difficult to have them. The person who's doing that is not respecting you, and they're going to continue disrespecting you unless there are consequences.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because some people don't respect boundaries unless there are consequences. And sometimes they do that because they don't recognize it's a boundary, Sometimes they do it just because they're the kind of person that you maybe don't want in your life.
Yeah.
Or they need to grow.
And I feel like for me it's become a lot easier to voice each other's boundaries and then just sort of go from there and like not violating each other's boundaries. That's usually where I start with agreements and stuff.
Yeah, I think basing agreements around boundaries can be really helpful. Okay, so Jared said, is there an example of a rule that seemed okay at first and then fell apart? I feel like the OPP is one penis policy is something I'd reject from the onset.
Okay. I have I have examples from my own experiences. And I actually have a really good example of this framed in two different ways. So if you make a rule, okay, for instance, that you don't want okay, so you have a nesting partner and you and your nesting partner sleep in the same shared space, and you don't want your nesting partner to bring other partners home and have sex in the bed that you sleep in, and say like that's a thing that you make into a rule. I feel like that your nesting partner might be like, well, where do we have sex then? Do I always have to go to that person's place? What if that's not a thing I can even do? And it's a whole thing. Whereas I feel like if it's framed in a way that's like this is a boundary for me in the space that I sleep in, I don't want somebody else in there doing that thing because it's my space. Maybe you can come up with like a negotiation solution to that so it's not violating your boundary but also giving your partner space, like having two separate spaces for you. Even if most nights you end up sleeping in the same room, maybe you have a second room. And that's like,
yeah, or like an agreement that sheets have to be changed and bed remade whenever that happens, or just things like that, ways that you can work together to come up with a solution.
Yeah, because that actually started out as a rule in one of my relationships and ended up being just like let's negotiate our boundaries around this and then figure it out.
Yeah, and there's also and my brain is doing the blanking thing again. Wow, my brain just shut off. Okay, I'm gonna shut up now. Do you want to say anything?
Okay, so this is not a personal experience, but one that I read in a story online that I thought was really funny was like this couple is starting out trying to open their relationship up and be polyamorous, and they wrote out a list of rules for each other, and they said that they ranged from like really like flexible kind of just like obvious and simple negotiations like have safe sex to all the way to the incredibly insecure. Like one of them was like, we won't have dates with other people more than once a month. Like that was absolutely not going to happen. So like so a big thing I think with this is respecting autonomy.
Yes.
A lot of the time rules are framed in a way that shows some amount of possession over the other person. So like doing things like that, like limiting somebody's time with someone else is sort of, other than like I mentioned with the agreements, like this is our date night, but like saying like, oh, you can only see other people once a month is pretty like not very respecting of their autonomy.
So Ray asks, what are some of the most common poly rules aside from OPP that you see being an issue? I mean rules in general, but what are some that you've seen? I generally have shied pretty heavily away from rules.
Yeah.
So I don't have very many examples. I guess just like about limiting time or oh, here's an example. Partners, a lot of times people will say, yes, that's the one I was about to bring up. Thank you,
Yes.
Nate. Have to check in before sex or before dating someone new, before going on a date, because sometimes it just is something that comes up spontaneously.
Yeah.
And there are exceptions to every rule, and there has to be flexibility for that. Sarah said the rule where you can't be intimate with others unless you clear with nesting partners. So yeah, the same thing. That is definitely a.
I was so concerned about that being a thing, that with one of my partners, I actually said, hey, if you're like away on a trip somewhere and something happens with somebody that I don't really know, that's fine. Just like let me know later, because I don't want you to miss out on something, like
Yeah.
because you're trying to tell me about it. And like don't do that. Just do your thing and then let me know what happened. Pretty much.
And just make sure to stay as safe as we've agreed, or if not, let me know so that I can take my necessary precautions.
Yeah.
So Ray said prescriptive hierarchy, that the primary partner must always be put first, and regardless of how close you may get to others, the primary relationship comes first.
Yes.
So this is a big problem, because if the intensity of a dynamic changes, what happens then? And what happens to the people who you are in a relationship with that aren't primary? Are they just a tool? Like I mean, it restricts their autonomy. It restricts the relationship with another person, and it deprioritizes their rights and their autonomy within a relationship.
I have a lot of issues with hierarchy in general, which actually, was a thing that bothered me from the very beginning when I started in polyamory. I was like, I don't like this idea that somebody is more important than everybody else. But like, I'm not trying to really tell anybody like that you have to change your, morals or your personal morals about the thing. But like you just said about the intensity of different relationships changing, the intensity that I will have between one partner and another partner and whatever is so flexible and changes so much. Like, I don't think that it works very well to have like a prescriptive hierarchy for me. And I generally think that it can be problematic. That's definitely, yeah.
So I do want to say prescriptive, we're using the word prescriptive because there's a contrasting one, which is descriptive, which is something that's used to describe the intensity of a relationship at that moment that is open to change.
Yeah.
So Nikki said controlling someone's other partners based on your prejudices is another I see a lot. And Nate said escaping prescriptive hierarchy was like a rite of passage. That's a big one. Does anybody else have any other examples of rules that they've dealt with or had and gotten rid of, or have now, or have questions about? Or does anybody have any other questions for us on these topics? Or do you have anything more you want to say? So
I don't think so.
Okay. So in that case, we have, I think, finished this. Okay, so here's something. Ray said, there's a big difference between this person is more important because we say so, and that's just how it's going to be harder. And right now, I feel closest to this person and want specific things with them, and our dynamic reflects that. And yes, there is.
Harder.
So yeah, that is very important. That distinction.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense that, like, you know, when you choose to share space and finances and that with somebody, that like that can be more of like descriptive hierarchy, but it can change.
Yeah. And being open to change and communicating is just the important part. Well, in any case, we keep. Oh, Ray's saying talk about cats. You don't want to start me on that. It will go on for like 16 days, and you'll be like, "Come on, I'm hungry. Just give me food." I'll eat a cat if you talk about cats anymore.
Wow.